What does it mean to be a Western yogi? How can someone who was born and raised in the West, who comes from a Judeo-Christian background, practice yoga and meditation in an authentic and genuine way? My name is Christopher Sartain, and this is the Western Yoga Podcast. Greetings, fellow seekers. Welcome to another episode of the Western Yoga Podcast. I'm actually in Santiago, Chile right now, traveling a bit. We have a yoga teacher training happening here, also on the coast in Viña del Mar, a couple of hours from Santiago. And so my wife and I are up here in Santiago, staying at our house here, and working a bit and spending a lot of time with my wife's family. And so I don't have my normal microphone with me, and I'm in the city, so you might hear some cars and traffic and dogs barking. But I wanted to record an episode while I was here, and so let's see how this goes. I want to talk more about the Gospel of Thomas, Christian mysticism, the original teachings of Jesus Christ, and we'll start with a little more information about the Essenes. You've heard me in previous podcasts discuss the fact that John the Baptist and Jesus, and probably Jesus' parents, all come out of this Essene tradition. And the Essenes were a group of sort of a breakaway Jewish group that had some things in common with the other Jewish sects of that time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But they also had a lot of really important differences. And the Essenes had essentially broken off and rejected the priestly class of their time and the temple and everything. They believed that they had become corrupted by Roman influence and all of that, and had strayed away from the original religion. And so they went off to the desert around the Dead Sea, around the area of Galilee, and they had started their own communities there in the desert, sort of ascetic communities. These were basically monks, although there were a few small communities of householders. And so it's really important to understand the Essenes were not monolithic. In other words, it was a diverse group. And so each community seemed to have some of its own beliefs, some of its own writings and whatnot. For example, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found near the Dead Sea, the community of Qumran, which we believe was in fact an Essene community. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, you have some writings that are attributed to the Essenes. Although, in these writings, the Essenes refer to themselves as the sons of light, or the children of light. And it is my contention that this was but one sect of the Essene community. and was not representative of the entire community of Essenes, but was one sect, one portion of that community. And so that these writings are not representative of the entire Essene movement, but one part of it that was located around Qumran. And they refer to themselves as the sons of light in those particular writings. Now, the Essenes were vegetarians. They did not perform animal sacrifices, and they ate a very light vegetarian diet, which was different, of course, from the rest of the Jewish population at that time, who did perform animal sacrifices, ate meat, a kosher diet. But the Essenes were, in fact, vegetarians. They did not consume any meat. The Essenes were also anti-slavery. They did not own slaves, and they did not believe in slavery. This was quite revolutionary at that time. Well, not just in that particular part of the world, but really in the ancient world in general. Slavery is a very ancient institution, has been with us, unfortunately, for many thousands of years. So slavery is a very ancient institution, unfortunately, and so it was quite revolutionary, I would say, that the Essenes were anti-slave, and they were, in fact, egalitarian, communists, if you will, of their day. There was no real hierarchy, although it does look like there's some evidence when we excavate the graves around some of the Essene communities. There did seem to be some hierarchy. In other words, it does look as though it looks like certain people were given better burials than others, and were considered more important members of the community and whatnot. But for the most part, they were egalitarian, and they shared everything, and they did not have classes. So it was essentially, for the most part, a classless society. And they did not believe in classes or wealth, for that matter. They had a very simple lifestyle, and they did not believe in excess or wealth. They saw them as sinful. And so these were very simple, monastic people living a very egalitarian lifestyle. What we might term nowadays as a sort of hippie commune, more or less. And again, they were vegetarians, and they were healers. And so we see a later movement in Egypt, I believe, called the Therapeutae, something like that, that most scholars believe sort of came out of the Essene movement of Israel. And this was a group of healers also associated with the Essenes. Some people believe that the word Essene actually means healer. And so these were herbalists. They had extensive knowledge of ancient herbal remedies and herbal medicines. And so they were herbalists, and they used their knowledge of local plants and medicinal herbs to offer healing to those within their own communities, but also outside of the Essene communities. And so they were healers. They had extensive knowledge of herbalism and healing techniques. and they wore all white as a symbol of purity, purification, spirituality. They were very intent on becoming as pure as possible. And so they wore all white, and they also practiced ritual bathing. And if you look at Qumran, this ruin, there are many baths or pools, small pools, where the Essenes practiced ritual bathing. They were quite obsessive compulsive about it, really. To the point of being, sort of obsessive compulsive about purity. And before you could enter certain buildings or certain spaces, you had to bathe essentially in these waters that they had channeled into their community from a river or creek. And so they were vegetarians. They had a very pure diet. They wore all white. They practiced ritual bathing, and they were celibate, except of course for the small householder communities where families lived. Although it must be said that they were only supposed to have sex for the purposes of procreation, even within those householder communities. So they were very strict when it came to sex. And so the vast majority of the members of the Essene community were men, celibate men, who did not marry, did not have children, and all of that. As a matter of fact, I believe if a woman wanted to marry an Essene man, I believe they went through a period of probation, basically, before they were allowed to marry. There were some very strict rights around all of these things, and as a matter of fact, if someone wanted to join, a man just wanted to join the Essene community in general, he actually went through a 2 or 3 year probationary period before I think he was really allowed to enter the community. And so they were very strict about having a long sort of preparatory period prior to being initiated into what was essentially a mystery school. So this was a very strict group. And again, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they referred to themselves as the sons of light. They believed that they were the purest form of Judaism at the time, and that they were sort of the chosen ones, as it were. And that their form of Judaism was the most correct and purest form, the highest form of Judaism. Now, when you look at the Dead Sea Scroll writings, there are a lot of teachings and things in there that I don't particularly like or agree with. So, it's easy for us to draw conclusions based upon their lifestyle as vegetarians, all of the purity and the mental hygiene, the spiritual hygiene, the physical hygiene, and the fasting, the long prayers, the meditation in the desert, and all this, and their flowing white robes. It's easy for us to draw conclusions based upon all that, these were sort of ancient yogis, more or less, like the yogis of India. That's not exactly accurate. and some of their beliefs I don't particularly agree with, and so there's some things about the Essenes that I don't particularly like. It seems as though John the Baptist and Jesus were on the same page because they left the Essene community. As a matter of fact, it's quite possible that John the Baptist was sort of kicked out and made to wander the desert. Essentially, if you were ostracized from the Essenes, if you did something they didn't like, or you broke one of the laws, and there were many, some of these Dead Sea Scrolls are essentially just lists of all of the laws and everything that you have to follow to be able to live in an Essene community is quite strict. So it's possible that John disagreed with some things or had a falling out with one of the leaders there, and it's possible that he was ostracized because, he wandered around the desert just eating beans, basically, and weeds and stuff, and alone. And so that was the punishment for someone that had been ostracized from the Essene community. They were basically never allowed to come back, and they were supposed to just live out in the desert by themselves, ostracized from their community. And that's what John the Baptist did, and that was his lifestyle. And although he continued many of the Essene practices, such as baptism and a vegetarian diet and purification, fasting, periods spent in solitude in the desert, praying and meditating and all of that. So he continued a lot of the Essene practices and traditions, but he went off and, he did his own thing. He started his own ministry, essentially, and had his own followers and disciples, Jesus being one of them. And so it looks like that Jesus' parents were also probably part of the Essene community. Jesus' brother James, for example, was a vegetarian, we know, and James the Just, or James the Righteous, so-called, who was the earliest leader of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death, and he was a vegetarian, and so most likely Jesus was also a vegetarian, and therefore, most likely Jesus' parents were also vegetarians. They were probably part of this Essene community. But John the Baptist broke away, or was kicked out, and he started his own ministry, did his own thing, but he carried on a lot of that Essene tradition, the initiation, the baptism, the vegetarian diet, the ritual purification, fasting, prayer, solitude, and all of that. And so this Essene community was quite revolutionary for its time, and that is the context out of which Jesus and his teachings comes about. And so it's important for us to understand that. Now, Jesus' teachings are far deeper, far more profound, far more enlightened than some of the teachings you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So he was far above and beyond whatever the Essenes had been doing. But it is interesting to note that he does come out of that historical context, and it influenced greatly his approach to spirituality. It influenced his teachings, influenced his life, influenced his lifestyle, and all of that. So again, was this a perfect sect of enlightened yogis living in the ancient deserts of ancient Galilee? No. But it was a sort of mystery school that had initiatory rites and was certainly far more enlightened than the other Jewish sects of the day. And so we can see that Jesus took some things from the Essene community, but expanded on them further and really took it to another level. Okay? Because while the Essenes were mystics in a certain sense, they weren't purely mystical. They were also quite religious and held to a lot of the religion or the customs and traditions and practices of the Jewish religion. And they come out of Judaism. And so they're quite tied to religion. They're not purely mystical. Jesus was. Jesus was a mystic. And so what he teaches, especially in the Gospel of Thomas and his original teachings, or shall we say the purest form that we have available to us of his original teachings. In the Gospel of Thomas, the teachings are quite mystical. And so we can easily say that Jesus was, even a lot of the teachings in the so-called canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are quite mystical. And so Jesus was a mystic, a pure mystic. He had no interest in religion. So that's how he differs from the Essene context out of which he arises, and why he was so revolutionary, much like the Buddha and other mystics. Let me explain the difference between mysticism and religion, or a mystical tradition and a religious tradition. This is key. Religions have their basis in beliefs and belief systems. Mysticism or mystical traditions have their basis in experience. So in other words, religions have beliefs about the divine. Mystics want to experience the divine. In mysticism, we wish to have a direct experience of the divine. We want to know the divine. We're not really interested so much in beliefs about the divine. We want to know the divine. We want to experience the divine directly in our own being. And so we want to experience that. We want to have that union, that divine union, this mystical experience, in the yoga tradition referred to as samadhi. Okay? So that's the difference between a religion and a mystical tradition. My guru, Roy Eugene Davis, said often, don't be a believer, be a knower. And this is really one of my favorite teachings from my guru. Don't be a believer, be a knower. And so this is so key to understanding the difference between a religion based on beliefs and a mystical tradition or mysticism based upon direct experience or knowledge. Okay? And so Jesus was a mystic, a pure mystic. And he had no real interest in religion, religious beliefs. I'm sure he espoused some of the Jewish beliefs because he came out of that context and he was preaching to Jews. And so he had his private teachings and his public teachings. And his private teachings were far more mystical, more advanced, more enlightened. whereas his public teachings were a little more easy to digest, and they were meant more for the general public, Jewish public, rather than his select few disciples who might be able to understand the higher teachings that have nothing to do with religion or Judaism. We see this same theme repeated with most revolutionary, mystical, religious figures like Jesus, like the Buddha, and many others. They come out of a religious context, however, their teachings transcend all religions because they are mystical teachings based upon experience rather than belief. And so Jesus is not unique in this sense. The Buddha, for example, um, was very revolutionary when he developed his teachings around the middle path and all of that. And although he came out of that Indian religious context that has come to be known as Hinduism, but certainly was not called that in ancient times. That's an English invention, that word, Hinduism, to describe a large group of religions and religious practices of India. At any rate, when we look at the Buddha, he sort of rejected the Vedic teachings to a certain extent. And so Buddhism is considered a non-orthodox Indian tradition. There are 6 so-called orthodox schools of Indian philosophy, let's say. Yoga, for example, Samkhya, for example, Vedanta, and others, yeah. Because they're all based on the Vedas, so they're considered orthodox schools of religious or philosophical thought. And there are 2 so-called non-orthodox schools of religious or philosophical thought in India, and those are Buddhism and Jainism, because they broke away from the Vedic teachings and that Vedic heritage somewhat, not entirely, but at any rate, for that reason, Buddhism is considered non-orthodox. So, and that's primarily because the Buddha was a mystic, and he was a mystical teacher. And the original Buddhism was mysticism, and there was not much concern about beliefs or religious traditions and rituals and ceremonies and all of that. Simply, the priority or the emphasis for the Buddha was awakening, enlightenment, gnosis, and enlightenment, spiritual awakening, knowing what you are, ending your suffering, ending your ignorance, direct experience of your highest nature, your true self. That was the Buddha's priority. That was also Jesus's priority. And that is the priority of all mystical teachers and mystical traditions throughout all of recorded history. Okay? And so it's really important to understand that Jesus was a mystic, he was a revolutionary, he was non-orthodox, but he comes out of this Essene Jewish context. And so if we want to understand Jesus, we have to understand the context out of which he arose, or his teachings arose. So when we look at the Gospel of Thomas, which again is based upon the so-called Q source, which were the earliest written accounts of Jesus and his teachings, and predating the canonical Gospels, and most likely predating Paul's writings, which occurred 20 or so years after Jesus' death. And so the Q source was probably written, it's possible that some of the Q source was even written down during Jesus' life. We don't know. But certainly was written down within a decade or so after his death. And later on also. The Q source was probably still being developed when Paul was writing his letters. At any rate, the earliest Q source material was simply Jesus' teachings, a sort of catalog or list of Jesus' sayings, his wisdom sayings. And therefore, the earliest written, recorded Christian writings are simply Jesus' sayings, Jesus' teachings. Because that's what was most important to him. His transmission of these mystic Enlightenment teachings to his disciples. And so Thomas wrote these sayings down, or probably not Thomas, probably a scribe associated with Thomas, perhaps. Thomas being Jesus' disciple that the Gospel of Thomas is attributed to. So these sayings were written down and kept, the so-called Q source material, and eventually that collection of sayings is what later became the Gospel of Thomas. Okay? The Gospel of Thomas, by the way, is not really called a gospel. It's the secret sayings of Jesus, I believe, is the actual title of the document that was found in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in I believe 1945, maybe 46, 47, in that period. And so it's not necessarily a gospel like the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Matthew, etc., the canonical Gospels. Really, it's just the secret sayings of Jesus. Why secret? Again, as I was discussing earlier, Jesus had private teachings and he had public teachings. What my guru and his guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, what they referred to as quantity and quality teachings. And so that the quantity teachings are for the masses, okay? And they're a little easier to understand. They use simpler language and more practical concepts, things that apply more to your day-to-day life and all of that. The private or the quality teachings are reserved for a select few who have the capacity to understand them and apply them. And so these are the higher esoteric mystical teachings, so-called quality teachings or private teachings. So for that reason, the Gospel of Thomas is titled the Secret Sayings of Jesus, because these were the higher mystical esoteric teachings that Jesus gave to Thomas, because Thomas could understand them, right? And so Thomas was essentially a very advanced disciple of Jesus, a very enlightened disciple. He was Jesus' spiritual twin. Thomas eventually took Jesus' teachings all the way to India, where he lived during his later years and eventually died, and is considered the sort of father of Eastern Christianity, which has a more mystical bent, generally speaking. And so Thomas was essentially Jesus' most advanced disciple, spiritually, Jesus' most enlightened disciple, just as Jesus was John the Baptist's most enlightened disciple. And so this is how a lineage typically operates when it's functioning correctly. There's an enlightened teacher, or at the very least a semi-enlightened teacher, who has disciples. And of those disciples, generally speaking, there are a handful, typically, that are quite advanced and enlightened themselves. And they generally go off and become teachers in their own right and have their own disciples. And each one of those teachers has a few disciples also that wake up substantially. And they have their own students and so on and so forth. And so it's this tree that grows out of the roots of an enlightened master, like Jesus, like the Buddha, like Paramahansa Yogananda, like my guru, Roy Eugene Davis, and so on and so forth. So this lineage continues. Jesus was a part of such a lineage, and Thomas was part of such a lineage. And so this is something that Jesus' tradition had in common with the sort of yoga tradition of India, this guru-disciple relationship, and a guru line or a guru lineage, a lineage of awakened masters that transmit their teachings and their enlightened energy, Shakti pot, so-called, and their enlightened consciousness to their disciples. And it's an unbroken chain. There's an unbroken chain of transmission when there is a true guru lineage at work. And so Jesus was part of such a tradition. And so the Gospel of Thomas is a collection of Jesus's enlightenment teachings. What does enlightenment look like? How can we become enlightened? And all of that. And it, again, is based upon this Q material, this Q source, which was just a collection of Jesus' mystical teachings, because Jesus was a mystic. And true Christianity, original Christianity, is mysticism. Pure and simple, like yoga, like the original Buddhism, or any other mystical tradition. It's mysticism. It's not a religion. That was developed, of course, after Jesus died, by Paul and others interested in continuing Christianity and promoting Jesus' teachings and life and all of that. Although Paul greatly corrupted what Jesus had originally taught, and many others did as well. We find a lot of those corruptions in the so-called canonical Gospels, although there's some good stuff in there too. It's a mix. At any rate, so the most important thing for Jesus was this transmission of enlightened consciousness onto his disciples and future students of those disciples, right? And so that was Jesus' priority. His priority wasn't to create a religion based upon the ideas of salvation for his death on the cross. He had no interest in that. And so Christianity is mysticism. Jesus was a mystic. it's interesting because even many mainstream sort of Christians would admit that Jesus was a mystic and that he was very mystical. But they're not mystics. Isn't that interesting? They don't practice mysticism. They are religious believers and have no interest in mysticism, even though their teacher, their spiritual hero, was in fact a mystic and taught mysticism to his followers. But they have no real interest in mysticism, mystical practices, meditation, and yet they would, many of them would freely admit that Jesus was a mystic and that he was quite mystical. But there's no real interest in mysticism. There is a growing interest in Christian mysticism. Slowly but surely, there are more and more Christians who are interested in meditation, in mystical practices, in the writings of the Christian mystics of Europe, for example, Francis of Assisi, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, and many others. And these are wonderful, wonderful writings that they left us. Very similar to Buddhist teachings or yoga teachings. It's mysticism. And so Jesus was a mystic. Thomas, of course, was a mystic. And Thomas took these teachings to the East. But also this sort of Thomasine tradition seems to have found its way into Egypt, and it went on to influence the early Desert Fathers, so-called, who were the earliest Christian mystics who lived in the deserts of Egypt in caves, many of them, or tiny monasteries. And they were the first monks, the first Christian monks. And so they lived solitary lives, prayed, meditated, read, ate very little, and they were mystics. And so they went on to later influence many of the European mystics, I believe. And so that there's this continuous tradition or lineage of Christian mysticism going all the way back to Christ, and then to Thomas, and then later to the East in places like Syria and Iraq, modern day, and all the way into India, but also in Egypt. Okay? And then in Europe. On to the modern day. There are many wonderful modern Christian mystics and writers who I really treasure. Thomas Keating, for example, Richard Rohr, for example, many. So, in a future episode, perhaps I'll feature a few of the modern Christian mystics who I really admire and highlight some of their highest teachings. Anyway, for now, I think I'll go ahead and conclude. I hope you've enjoyed this brief overview of the history of the Essenes and the history of the Gospel of Thomas and the early Christian mystical tradition and movement. Thank you so much for listening. Please share the podcast with your like-minded friends and other spiritual seekers. Until next time, many blessings. Namaste.